Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. I hope there are still some chairs available. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to give a warm welcome to Mr. Josep Borrell, designate for the post of High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Vice-President of the Commission. A warm welcome to you, dear Josep Borrell, in this committee. We are happy to have you here this afternoon because this is a valuable opportunity for dialogue and a first step towards a constructive and fruitful cooperation with the European Parliament. This is a House, of course, which you know very, very well, and I have no doubt that you are committed to developing close links and effective interaction with the European Parliament for the future. I would like to remind colleagues that the purpose of this hearing is for the Parliament to evaluate the Commissioner-designate on the basis of his general competence, his European commitment, and his personal independence. The hearing also provides the opportunity to access the Commissioner-designate's knowledge of his prospective portfolio and his communication skills. Colleagues, on the 27th of September, we received Mr. Borrell's responses to our written questions, which have been distributed to members in all languages, and they were also published on the website of the Parliament. Please let me now describe shortly the structure of this hearing, which has been put in place under Parliament's rules of procedure in order to ensure an equal and a fair opportunity for all Commissioners designate to present themselves and their opinions. Firstly, the Commissioner designate will be invited to give an opening oral statement of no longer than 15 minutes. After his introduction, there will be time for 25 questions from the members. In the first round, we will have the questions put forward by the speakers of the political groups, and in the second round, we will have the questions put forward by 18 members according to the quotas allocated to the different political groups, including also a representative from the non-attached members. The 5-minute time slots of questions and answers are composed as follows. Each member has 1 minute for asking his or her question. This is followed by a 2-minute answer by the Commissioner-designate. Then, if needed, there is a possibility for the same member to ask an immediate follow-up question of maximum 1 minute, and the Commissioner-designate can then give a 1-minute answer to that follow-up question. Let me remind colleagues that the follow-up question must relate to the Commissioner-designate's reply to the first question and shall not be used to raise other matters. At the end of the hearing, the Commissioner-designate will have 5 minutes for a closing statement. The total time of this hearing is strictly limited to 3 hours. Therefore, I would ask colleagues to remain within the speaking time allocated to them. If colleagues speak for more than the time allocated to them, they will take speaking time away from other colleagues. That's why I have this hammer. I don't want to use the hammer, but I'm warning you, if you are speaking longer than allowed, I will knock once. That means you have to come to an end. If I knock twice, then your speaking time is definitely finished. Finally, interpretation is provided into 23 languages. And this hearing will be web-streamed live on the Parliament's website, and it will also be possible to access a video recording of the hearing on the same site. Now, before I give the floor to the Commissioner-designate, I would like to stress the importance of this hearing for the potential for close and effective dialogue between the High Representative and the European Parliament, as regards the external action of the European Union, at a time where the EU is confronted by many challenges, but can also play an important role in promoting a solution to so many global issues. It is important to reinforce the parliamentary dimension of the external action of the EU and to ensure close interinstitutional policy dialogue and cooperation. That's all from my side. Dear Commissioner-designate, you may now have the floor for your opening statement of exactly 15 minutes. The floor is yours.
Dear members, I'm happy to be back in the European Parliament, honored and humbled by the magnitude of the responsibilities I will face if I get your support. I fully recognise the vital contribution of the European Parliament in shaping European foreign policy and the added value of the parliamentarian diplomacy as you did in Ukraine. One of my main responsibilities will be to inform, consult and ensure your views are taken into account. I strongly believe that a strong European Union foreign policy requires a strong democratic support. In my opening statement, I will approach in a conceptual basis rather than a geographic approach for reason of time. But let me stress from the beginning my intention to engage on the reforms and integration processes in the Western Balkans to support democracy and territorial integrity of Ukraine, address the challenges in our southern neighbourhood, there are many of them, develop a new comprehensive strategy towards Africa, working out a politically rounded strategy in and with Asia, stepping our cooperation with Latin America, and resetting transatlantic relations as I discussed in New York recently with Secretary of State Pompeo the last time we met, resetting transatlantic relations. I'm happy to discuss about all of this and also about how we can work together for democracy and human rights in these very challenging times. Let me first set out my overall vision. Dear members, Mr. Chair, we will soon be celebrating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was the triumph of freedom, enabling the reunification of Germany and Europe in peace and democracy. But it also brought key strategic challenges. Most of them were addressed with European policies, the enlargement, the euro, and the starting of a common foreign policy. And that was also the spirit during my time at that House. But since then, the world has changed dramatically and for worse, for much worse. Now we have trade wars, climate change, refugee crisis, instability in our neighbourhood, hybrid threats. The rule-based international order is being challenged by the logic of power politics, which is much more unfair, unpredictable, and conflict-prone. What does it mean, power politics? Power politics means that the international law is undermined. There are few agreements and more vetoes. And the territorial integrity of sovereign states is being violated, as the war in Ukraine demonstrates. The non-proliferation and disarmament system is threatened, and embargoes are broken in Libya and elsewhere. But power politics means that trade, technology and finance are used as tools of international competition. They become political weapons. There is no uncertainty about the international role of the United States. There are new threats coming from the East, and China is as much a systemic rival as an economic opportunity and a partner on global issues. We have around us a fragile neighbourhood and the demographic dynamism of Africa, and in Latin America, our ally on multilateralism, some countries are facing threats to democracy and security. Dear members, this is not the world the European Union wanted. But I am convinced that we have what it takes to face this challenging environment, because we are, and we must be proud of it, the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion in the world. We have the resources. We have the support of our population and strong institutions. And we need to build on this. This is how I read the political guidelines of the President-elected Ursula von der Leyen, who has defined this Commission as a geopolitical commission and asked me to work for a stronger Europe in the world. A stronger Europe in the world. Dear members, how do we do? We should pull our national sovereignties together to multiply the power of individual member states. And I am convinced that we don't act together, Europe will become irrelevant in the new coming world. To pull national sovereignties is a political decision, easier to proclaim than achieve. My old friend Jacques Delors said, we must reconcile Sunday speeches with Monday actions. But for that we need a truly integrated foreign policy that combines the power of member states acting together in the Council, with all policy managed by the Commission and the democratic legitimacy of this House. This was the promise of the Lisbon Treaty. If I am confirmed, the heart of my work as Vice President and High Representative will be to bridge the foreign policy of the Member States with the external action of the Commission. I know it's not an easy task, but I will do my best. Geopolitics, one could say, begins at home. Why? First, because to be geopolitically relevant, we need unity, much more than the one we have. I will work with all member states, big and small, to achieve this unity. Second, because we need coherence between internal and external policies. And we have the instruments to play power politics. Our challenge is to put them together at the service of one strategy. We are key normative power in setting worldwide rules and standards. We have a powerful common trade policy. Powerful because it's common. We are a true leader in shaping the 2030 agenda, which represents the new global consensus on building sustainability. Our budget, together with those of the member states, makes us a financial superpower, and our diplomatic capacity is among the strongest in the world. We should reinforce the Euro international role and further our military capacity to act. To sum up, in a single sentence, the European Union has to learn to use the language of power. We often say, partnerships and multilateralism are in our collective DNA. Yes, but you cannot be multilateralist alone. So we need partners. But many of our partners are disengaging from the rules-based system, and others are applying rules in a selective and self-serving way. Europe has to position itself among the growing confrontation between US and China. Confrontation or a strategic competition, whatever you want. We have to back rules-based multilateralism and promote our own approach, avoiding being squeezed between the two of them. We are, and we will remain, allies of the US, strong allies. But we have legitimate concerns about unilateral moves that go against decades of cooperation. The rules-based system can and should be reformed, but not abandoned. We also have to welcome the positive Chinese moves on climate change and on the Iran nuclear deal. But we expect China to work with the rules of the system. Reciprocity and level playing field must be the basic principles of our relationship, for instance, on trade, investment and connectivity. Mr. Chairman, dear members, European citizens say that the two biggest challenges they face are climate change and migration. Both are geopolitical challenges because we cannot solve them alone. Even if we become carbon neutral, the European Green Deal will have to help others to move in the same direction, or we will not solve the problem. Climate change poses the biggest problem of redistribution after the Industrial Revolution, inside the EU and beyond, among countries and among citizens. It's a driver of instability and migratory pressures that we will have to face both at home and abroad. That's why there are geopolitical issues. Migration and asylum have profound geopolitical implications also. The humanitarian tragedy of Syria created the 2015 spike in asylum seekers. But migration is a structural issue. It requires border control, for sure, but mainly requires a true partnership with origin and transit countries, mainly from Africa. I'm coming from Spain, I have certain experience on that. We think that in a no so distant future, Africa will have over 1 billion people more. Not 1 billion people, 1 billion people more. Don't look at that only through the eyes of migration. It's also an opportunity if we are able to set up a comprehensive strategy that integrates trade, investment, security, education, mainly education. Women's empowerment, it will not be a solution without women empowerment in Africa. Mobility, altogether. We need to think big and creative, developing a common strategic vision. We have the tools to do so. And we cannot renounce what we are every time a migration crisis comes, be it big or small. Dear members, let's talk now about security and defense. Our strength lies in our ability to link diplomacy, mediation, crisis management, and internal and external aspects of security. This is the way we promote peace. We have hybrid threats, including disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks that jeopardize our democracies. I am conscious of the gravity of these threats, and I will advance on going on. Defense is a part of our security, and sometimes threats start far away from our borders. We have recently put in place instruments to develop more usable defense capabilities. We have to go further. Member States are deploying 35,000 women and men worldwide in different types of international missions. That's impressive, but we have to do more. Our military spending is roughly half the GDP of Belgium, more than China, much more than Russia, second only to the United States. We spend 40%, but our capacity is much lesser because our fragmentation and duplication. We have to spend together. We have to spend better. The best thing was spending better is spending together. We have to be more operational in the ground. We have to deploy forces starting in our neighborhood. Rethink about the Helsinki headlines goals. Remember, 1999, after the Yugoslavian war, we are going to be able to deploy 50 or 60,000 troops on the ground. Where is this commitment? Let's be clear. NATO is and will remain the cornerstone of our collective alliance, of our collective defense. But developing European defense, we will reinforce the Atlantic Alliance. And by carrying more weight in NATO, we will contribute to a more balanced transatlantic relationship. Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Député.
Chairman, honourable members, rather than being the third pillar of geostrategic rivalry. We should envisage a Europe which can defend itself while working for a multilateral, peaceful world order, respecting human rights, and pursuing sustainable development goals. So that was my Sunday sermon, honourable members. But I would rather this as my Monday speech because I'm very keen to move from words to action if you place your trust in me. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Designate, and thanks for sticking exactly to your speaking time. We start now with the first round of questions. Once again, as a reminder, it's a question by a colleague for 1 minute. The Commissioner Designate has the opportunity to answer for 2 minutes. A follow-up question is possible for 1 minute, and the answer then again is 1 minute. Please stick to your speaking times. And we begin with Mr. Antonio Lopez for the EPP Group. The floor is yours.
Muy buenas tardes, señor Borrell.
Good afternoon, Mr. Borrell. Let's go from words to action. You are hoping to take over from Mrs. Mogherini. I think her management of foreign policy has been disastrous. She has not been firm enough with these authoritarian regimes or those in Latin America. We see an unprecedented humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. All attempts at dialogue supported by Mogherini have failed and just given further strength to the regime. This is an unacceptable farce. We're seeing the torture and imprisonment of the opposition in Cuba as well since the agreement has come into force. There has been no changes whatever in the regime, and the government continues to imprison and torture those who oppose it. And the same with Daniel Ortega. What is your position towards these countries and the application of sanctions when it comes to violation of human rights? This type of populism that attacks the rule of law in Latin America is similar to the populism and nationalism we see in Europe. I know the situation in Catalonia well, so what is your position as High Representative?
Thank you. Commissioner Designate.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez Isturias. You know very well that I share all of your concerns here for the Southern Hemisphere, for our country as well. I know that we have an agreement with Cuba that Mrs. Mogherini worked on, and there are periodic meetings, so Mrs. Mogherini is not going there on holiday. This is work. And these are agreements that the EU has signed with Cuba. Now, with regards to Venezuela, I know the situation there very well, the situation this country is experiencing. We are doing everything we can to ensure that there are democratic presidential elections, that they are safeguarded. I know that there is a terrible humanitarian situation in Venezuela. We're talking around 5 million people who have left the country. So what we're doing is applying political pressure and trying to negotiate so we can get these presidential elections. A large majority of European countries have made it clear that there is no democratic legitimacy anymore for President Maduro. So we need to continue following this line, but we need to be careful when it comes to sanctions that could negatively affect the Venezuelan people. But we will continue voting the right effective sanctions in Council. Let me just say very frankly, I don't want to see sanctions that affect the Venezuelan people anymore. They've already been hard enough hit and they're living in very difficult situations. I don't think they would be positive or legitimate. On the situation in Nicaragua, I have spoken out a number of times on this as Foreign Minister in Spain. I think Nicaragua is even worse than the situation in Venezuela.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell. Follow-up question, Mr. Lopez.
Yo sí de las sanciones.
I know that we have these individual sanctions that will not affect the people in Venezuela or Cuba. This is not the US here. We're talking about having a common position and taking a position or taking measures that will affect the regime. I think this is the way that we should act. The issue of individual sanctions, I think, is good, and I think we should continue working along this line. Let me just ask a tiny bit more about the issue of nationalism and populism. I know you are also against this. We need to be careful of this particular area and how it can affect Europe. Can you say a bit more about this?
Mr. Borrell, 1 minute.
Yes, of course. As you know, I have been very outspoken on this particular issue. I have spoken very firmly on this particular issue as needed, and as High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs, I won't be speaking about the internal situation in each of the member states. I will have a more general political position on populist movements around the world. I believe that a lot of the geopolitical problems that we have at the moment have local roots, and they are fed by these new sociological trends. If I could go into more depth on Nicaragua, but I'm not going to speak about the internal problems of particular EU member states.
Thank you. Next, for the S&D Group, Tonino Pizzula. 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome to the Parliament, Mr. Borrell. The Commission President-elect Ursula von der Leyen, as you said, indicated that the next Commission will be a geopolitical Commission. She envisaged a more strategic, assertive, coherent and united Union in its approach to foreign policy. To implement that, she tasked the High Representative with strengthening the link between the internal and external aspects of EU policies. We welcome this new approach. In the world increasingly dominated by geopolitical competition, EU should reconsider its so-called silos approach. We need to ensure the continued security and prosperity of our people, of course matching with our values. Principled pragmatism should guide all our external relations. Do you share the view that the traditional separation between different strands of EU external relations, such as foreign and security policy, trade and development, is no longer sustainable in the current global context? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Borrell, 2 minutes.
Por supuesto que hay que verlo como.
Well, of course, this has to be seen in the round. I think one of the major issues facing European foreign policy is the fact that it has been divided into silos. That derives from its actual institutional structure. The Commission has certain functions, the Council has others. But in the world we live in, we need to pool all our capacities. And we have a certain degree of shared economic sovereignty thanks to our common currency. There's an important role to be played here. I'm not saying this just to curry favour with you, but of course it's my duty to implement Article 83 of the Treaty, which says that Parliament must be listened to and its opinions must be borne in mind when we put the foreign policy together. You help shape foreign policy, particularly the more we listen to you, the more we will understand your concerns. So I can commit myself here to continuing to build on that positive dynamic. Following the Accountability Declaration in 2010, there is the implication that Parliament will be consulted, the plenary, the committees and the special committees, so that we can expound to you the most sensitive elements of our work in European foreign security and defence policy. I can also commit myself to explaining international negotiations to members because, again, this is a requirement of the Union Treaty. At least 5 times a year there will be consultation meetings as we seek to implement the CSDP budget. We want to resume negotiations where they've been broken off in line with the terms of Article 40 of the Interinstitutional Agreement on Better Lawmaking, which goes back to 2016.
Thank you. Follow-up question to Nino Pizzula.
Mr. Borrell, during the past 15 years, we transitioned from the ring of friends, as former Commission President Romano Prodi defined it, to ring of fire in much of our own neighbourhood. To reverse this trend, we need to reinvigorate our enlargement and neighbourhood policy as part of our global strategy. Mr. Borrell, in your tenure in the European Parliament, you strongly promoted the European parliamentary diplomacy. You supported it with the creation of Eurolat and Euromed, and also interparliamentary meetings with the national parliaments of the EU member. My question is, in this spirit, what are your views about the need for continued parliamentarization of the European Union's foreign policy? Do you recognise European Parliament ambitions to ensure that commitments undertaken by HRVP continue to be implemented and have a role in overseeing the future development of the EAS together with the implementation of EU external action instruments? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Borrell, 1 minute.
Well, I'd already started to answer that when I spoke about participation of MEPs when it comes to shaping foreign policy. And if I may, I can say that I was indeed behind the Euromed Assembly and the Eurolat Parliamentary Assembly, which has allowed this House to sit alongside parliamentarians from the Mediterranean area and from Latin America. And also, I have been keen on making certain that there are regular meetings between national parliaments and the European Parliament. That dates back to my time as President, and I think that's borne fruit, as has the fact that your chairman, Mr. McAllister, takes part in informal foreign affairs councils. And the DEVE committee, I was chair of DEVE myself in the past, also takes part in the development committee hearings.
Thank you. Next is for the Renew Europe group, Speaker Hilde Woutmans.
Mr. President, and welcome, Mr. Borrell. In the mission letter of President Ursula von der Leyen to you, it is stated that the EU should be more strategic, more assertive and more united, so that it can exercise global leadership. You also mentioned that in your introduction speech, we need to be more united, we need to be stronger. I hear that already a very long time. So my question is very simple. What actions do you intend to take to enforce unity among the member states? But please, only a straight answer to this question will be satisfying for our group, because I hear it too many times already. And I think maybe you can use 2 examples to make it very concrete. How will you have more unity towards Russia? Are you intending to have a new strategy for Russia? And then, on security and defense, which is also a very priority for our group, how will you have unanimity towards more security and defense? Thank you very much.
Thank you. 1 minute for a straight answer.
Señora diputada, muchas.
I thank the honourable member for her question. I beg your pardon?
Si existiera una.
I said that if I could provide a reply in 2 minutes to the question of how we can be united in our action, I'm sure someone would have found that answer before me. An impossible question, one of cosmic significance, but as you know, the role of the High Representative is not just to act as a mediator or consensus builder. Above all, we have to come forward with proposals to iron out the inevitable differences amongst us. We need a shared strategic culture. We need to enhance the way we understand the world. Because of our historic and cultural traditions, we don't all see the world in the same way. But we have a lot in common, otherwise we wouldn't be here. We have to go beyond the lowest common denominator. For that, all you need is a computer. A bit of AI would do the job. But if what you want to achieve is an understanding, bringing together our visions of the world so that we can press ahead with joint action, what you need is a lot of empathy to understand points of view that are often contradictory. Russia is a good example of that. We have to maintain our sanctions on Russia until such time and as there is a tectonic change. Now, that will require a great degree of unity. As you're well aware, it would be enough for one country to vote against the extension of sanctions next time around for the sanction regime to fall. Now, that's an example of where unanimity is required. I represented my country for 10 years in three formations of the Council, and I believe I'm in a position to say that this task of building agreement revolves to a great extent around willpower, but also the capacity to do this, and rest assured that I have that capacity.
Thank you, Commissioner-designate Hilde Woutmans, for a follow-up question.
Well, thank you very much. And then the second question is, how will you actually challenge the member states that are unwilling to cooperate or move forward on foreign affairs and defense? Are you prepared to take risks there? Because I really think that sometimes you need to convince member states to put steps forward. You take the example of Russia. You said, yeah, one vote is enough to challenge, to stop the sanctions. But for me, the system like now it's not a good system. We have a Cold War with a neighboring country. There is growing up a whole generation of Russian young people with anti-European feelings. So I think sometimes we have to take some risks. So how will you convince member states that are not prepared moving forward? Are you willing to take some risks over there?
Thank you. Commissioner-designate, 1 minute.
Sí, claro que asumiré.
Well, of course, I'm prepared to take on some risks. No, the risk that the Council will not adopt my proposals. I'll run the risk of finding myself in a minority position vis-à-vis colleagues. In certain instances, it may be that we'll use the provisions of the treaty which says that you don't always have to be in agreement to 100%. When it comes to sanctions on human rights violations and CSDP missions, we might not require unanimity because the treaty, with the well-known passerelle clauses, would allow us to move to a position where we would do that. I know that if you want to change unanimity, you need a unanimous vote, but you don't need actually to amend the treaty. Not for everything. I'm not one of those who take the view that the qualified majority voting will solve all our foreign policy problems. I sometimes smile when I think that when it comes to economic policies and the financial perspectives, everyone clings to unanimity, whereas we call for qualified majority voting for far more essential issues such as war and peace.
Thank you. We now come to the group Greens EFA, and I give the floor to Reinhard Bütikofer.
Welcome, Mr. Borrell. I want to thank you, first of all, for early in your introductory remarks mentioning human rights as a core principle of the Union, even though human rights have not been mentioned a single time in your mission letter. I think we should stick to the core relevancy of human rights in Europe's foreign policy. You are certainly aware that some of your past remarks have raised eyebrows here and there. I would be happy if you could, during this hearing, find a word to address related concerns. Now, here's my question about EU and Asia. How much of a priority will you assign to the connectivity strategy that the EU has come up and that we just signed an agreement with Japan on to cooperate more? How will you make sure that there will be enough funding?
Thank you. Mr. Borrell, 2 minutes.
Muchas gracias, señor diputado, señor Bütikofer.
Thanks, Mr. Bütikofer. You have to tell me which comments of mine alarmed you, because I'll be delighted to clarify that for you. But on connectivity, let me say that connectivity is the megatrend of the 21st century. The whole question is going to boil down to how well the world is connected, and it's going to define standards of world governance. We have the EU Connecting Europe. We've been working with Asia since October last year, and I think this connectivity needs to follow three watchwords: sustainability, coverage, and rules-based. Sustainable.
Environmental, fiscal, and social. Comprehensive. It's not just about ports and bridges and physical infrastructures as we are used to. It is building networks for the digital age and people-to-people links. Third, rules-based. We need base rules in order to make states secure and people free and companies willing to invest, having security. Fourth, I think that we have to go forward. We have to go forward with three specific works. First, construir redes entre Europa y Asia.
Build networks between Europe and Asia in the key areas of energy, digitalization, and human connections. Secondly, work very closely with our friends. You mentioned the agreement with Japan, which was concluded on the 27th of September, only a few days ago. We need to do the same thing with Korea and India and the whole of ASEAN. Thirdly,
follow-up question, Reinhard Bütikofer.
I'm sure, Mr. Borrell, that your third point will be part of your second answer. And if you ask me which sentence caught my eye, it was, for instance, the sentence about the 4 killed Indians. You know that. But let me have a follow-up question. Siloed or stovepipe policy have been criticized by many of my colleagues already, and you said that too. But in your mission letter, the sentence that I found as the first sentence for Mrs. Mogherini 5 years ago does not appear. It says, as Vice President, you will be responsible for steering and coordinating the work of all commissioners with regard to external relations. This sentence is missing in your mission letter. Will you be able to do the coordination and steering on behalf of a unified foreign policy that overcomes silo and stovepipe?
Thank you. Mr. Borrell, 1 minute.
Bueno, es el artículo 18 de...
Well, it's Article 18 of the treaty. It's not a mission letter, it's Article 18 of the treaty, and it gives me the task of coordinating the external actions of the European Commission. One thing is external policies, which are fully external, and the other is an external mission of the European Union, where I would have to work with President van der Leyen. There's also the question of financing. We shouldn't forget there needs to be enough money to do this. There's this bridge that's being built in Croatia. It's 800 million euros or 400 million euros that we are paying 85% of, and the Chinese are also building one, and their workers are being lodged on a barge. When it comes to India, I want to apologise for my ill-chosen words. I just wanted to say that Europe will never be like the USA. We've got too much of a history of clashes among ourselves for that.
Thank you. The next speaker is from the ID Group, Mr. Mariani.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. In May of last year, in an interview with the Spanish press, you talked about Russia as our enemy, our real enemy. Now, we haven't actually had a reference to this, yet the real enemy in this hearing has been going on for 45 minutes, radical Islamic terrorism. We had deaths in France in just the last few days. All of our countries have suffered attacks. It's a real threat. The report to the Security Council in last July, talked about the last enclave in Syria, which had the largest reserve of foreign fighters in the world. So who really is the worst enemy of Europe? Is it Russia or is it terrorism? And if it's terrorism, what are you going to do to countries that are promoting it and financing, such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey?
Merci. Mr. Borrell, 2 minutes.
Sí, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I never said that Russia was an enemy of Spain. I was talking about Europe, and I will say the same as I said today in the hearing. The United States is in a more uncertain position now than it has been in the past. There are new threats which are emerging in the East. And that is why the ambassador to Spain was called to give explanations. But I never said that Russia was the enemy of Spain. I mean, if there aren't these new threats, why are our F-18s or certain components of the army deployed to the Balkans? Are they there just having a friendly coffee? No, it's because there are threats which are emerging. So we have the Canadian troops, the Spanish troops working together. So there is a threat that obviously isn't being felt in the same way in Spain as it is in Lithuania. But it is very important that we have these Spanish troops participating and dealing with this, which to a lot of Europeans is a real threat. You are saying that the Russians are trying to provoke us, but I think you should consider your words carefully. Obviously, terrorism is a very serious, significant threat. I don't want to have to compare which is the worst threat. Obviously, we experience terrorism a lot more up close and personal. We see soldiers patrolling our streets. What can I do? It's really what the European Union can do to tackle this. We have a whole range of different instruments. We have diplomacy. We have relations with those countries that create these terrorist threats, that are the origin of these threats. But it's not something that we can solve alone.
Thank you. Mr. Mariani.
Now, you admit that terrorism is a current threat. So as High Representative, what are you going to do with countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar or Turkey that has an ambiguous attitude when it comes to financing of terrorism? I think this is a subject that Europe needs to act on. Europe has a certain weight on the international stage. They have influence when it comes to these countries, and I think we're just not acting at all at the moment. And secondly, very briefly, these foreign fighters that are still abroad but are European nationals, should they be repatriated in Europe or should they be left where they are?
Thank you.
La primera cuestión.
Well, for the first question, I wouldn't say that Turkey has an ambiguous attitude to terrorists. Let's call a spade a spade. We all know that there has been financing or certain processes that are protecting or promoting terrorism in some way. But our relations with these countries need to be strengthened because we have a common enemy. Islamic terrorists kill a lot more Muslims than they do Christians. There are a lot more victims in the Arab world, in Africa, in Southeast Asia than here in Europe. Many more in terms of numbers. Sorry, could you just repeat the other question? Yes, we have some foreign fighters from Spain, and they are going to be repatriated. We believe a Spanish citizen is a Spanish citizen and would have such protection, and then they will go through the legal system when they get back to Spain.
Thank you. Let me now give the floor for the ECR group to Ms. Fotyga.
Thank you, Chair, Vice President, High Rep Designate. Here we advocate fulfillment of UN clause. We have the EU maritime security strategy and many violations of international law on the sea, South China Sea, East China Sea by China. We have blocking of Strait Hormuz, we have blocking of Kerch Strait and Azov Sea, we have piracy in Gulf of Aden, Gulf of Guinea, as well as in my native Vistula Lagoon. May I ask, how would you like to protect the EU maritime interests worldwide? I think that external aspects of maritime strategy are your direct responsibility.
Thank you. Mr. Borrell, 2 minutes.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. You attribute to me amazing powers and abilities. Controlling maritime traffic in all seas around the world would be a real Herculean task. But look, our task is to back our anti-piracy operation operating off the Horn of Africa. We have Spanish naval vessels providing wonderful protection to maritime traffic in that part of the world. We haven't deployed naval forces in the Indian Ocean, but you're quite right to be concerned about the Strait of Hormuz. As you know, there is an American naval protection force in the Strait of Hormuz. The EU does not form part of that. In the Council, we had recent discussions regarding the possibility of providing European naval forces in that area, but no agreement on that was forthcoming. I don't imagine agreement being found to that effect in the near future either. What I think should be done is that we should convene a regional conference under EU auspices so that all the parties involved can enter into a dialogue which will allow them to de-escalate the situation. Sending further naval forces at a time when circumstances might lead to a conflict being sparked off with unforeseeable consequences would not be the best solution. It's far better to work for de-escalation and convene talks amongst the parties who are heading towards a dangerous conflict. This would affect the whole geopolitical balance, not just there. And that's where we could play a vital role.
Thank you. Follow-up question, 1 minute, Anna Fotyga.
Thank you. It is Russia behind blocking of Kerch Strait and blocking freedom of navigation in the Azov Sea and in Vistula Lagoon as well. What is your attitude to sanction against vis-à-vis Russia because of its posture to Ukraine?
Mr. Borrell.
The Honourable Member is quite right. I didn't refer to that geographical area, which is particularly sensitive to us Europeans. Regarding sanctions on Russia, I believe I made my point earlier on, but I'm happy to return to this and reiterate the need to maintain strict unity amongst Europeans regarding maintaining those sanctions, which were established for 2 reasons. First of all, because of the illegal annexation of Crimea, and secondly, because of the violations of the territorial integrity of certain regions of Ukraine. Until such time as Russia changes its attitude on those sanctions must be maintained. I'm hopeful that there will be unanimity in the Council to ensure that. That doesn't mean to say that we mustn't also bear in mind the 5 principles of our relations with Russia. There's not just one principle governing our relations with Russia. The last of those 5 is that we are going to engage selectively with Russia on those points where there is some prospect of finding a drink for dialogue.
Thank you. Let me now give the floor for the GUI NGL group to Ms. Villanueva Ruiz. Por favor.
Señor Borrell. Bueno, en los últimos años...
Good afternoon, Mr. Borrell. In the last few years, we've seen a new arms race where the big powers like the US and Russia are breaking non-proliferation agreements and carrying out new nuclear tests. And at the same time, we're seeing an increase in armed conflict in all sorts of areas in the world, making the whole planet more uncertain and unsafe. There's also the fact that Turkey is attacking Kurdish communities in northern Syria, apparently with Mr. Trump's backing. What kind of role can the EU play that would work in the opposite direction, that would help create global security and help control arms and bring about disarmament? And when it comes to Turkey, are you going to take measures, for example, freezing EU financing to Turkey or stop selling them weapons? We can say, and I think you're right, that we are in a new era of nuclear instability. It's a very serious thing today, but I think it's true, because all of the agreements which put together as a kind of safety net to stop the proliferation of weapons and stopping them from being used have fallen away. So we in the European Union need to continue playing a role of pushing non-proliferation agreements when it comes to nuclear weapons, extend the ones we've got, and have non-proliferation, disarmament and peaceful use of nuclear energy. So how can we keep the Iran nuclear deal going? That's a question. We need, I think, to continue to work so that the test ban treaty comes into force. You're probably aware that there's no common position in the EU on a total ban on nuclear weapons. Not only one EU member state is really pushing this, and the others aren't really on board. The situation could change in Council, although I don't think it's likely to do so. But you'll understand that personally, I assume most of you am against nuclear weapons. But obviously in Council we have to deal with the positions of the member states, and the positions are as they are. When it comes to Turkey, I just learnt this morning that the situation is extremely serious. The US green light for Turkey to intervene directly on Iraqi territory is a problem for us in Europe. And if I were in office, I would look seriously at pushing the idea that that's not the way to solve the problem.
Thank you. A follow-up question, colleague?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, that sounds fine. And in Europe, however, at the moment we need deeds more than words. You've been a minister in Spain, and when you were, you ratified deals to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, a country which violates human rights. And are you going to commit yourself to trying to achieve action on the common position of 2018, which put together controls on weapons export? You've said that the signing of the nuclear ban treaty, which is still not happening in Spain, even though they've promised to do so. Don't you believe that under the present system based on non-proliferation, we need to show or go beyond showing and actually do something, and the European Union is in a position to do that? Thank you. as you'll be aware, I'm not going to speak about what Spain's foreign policy is. But by way of information, when I was part of the government, we came through on the commitments made by the previous government, but we didn't send any more weapons to Saudi Arabia. When it comes to the non-proliferation treaty, you'll be aware that it's going through the parliamentary process. The government wants to approve it, and until we've got something else, we have to work with that treaty and keep it in position. Next year, there's the chance to keep that treaty going because there's a hugely important meeting. We're going to make certain that that does happen. And when it comes to arms exports, I don't think we should just keep the common position of 2008 in position, but we should actually update it and radically overhaul it, because it's really quite out of date now. And when it comes to export control for the export of weapons, it needs to be revised. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Designate. Colleagues, we now come to the second round of questions, and I would like to give the floor for the EPP group to Ms. Cañete.
Thank you. Mr. Borrell, I'm here. Yeah. The Western Balkans are a priority area for the European Union due to the membership perspective. In your previous position as Spanish Foreign Minister, you represented a country which is non-recognizer of Kosovo. Do you envisage, as High Representative Vice-President, to be instrumental in urging the Spanish government to recognize Kosovo? If the non-recognition of Spain continues, inevitably your credibility and even integrity of your policy for the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue could be put into jeopardy. What solution do you propose for that? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Borrell for 2 minutes.
Recognition of Kosovo is a competence of member states. You know that we diverge in recognition, but we are united in engagement. And one thing is clear. Kosovo and Serbia have to reach an agreement. This is an important thing. And I will do my utmost in order to fulfill this priority. In fact, my first visit will be to Pristina. I know well Serbia. The Prime Minister of Serbia was invited to me to come to a Spanish university this summer. I've never been in Kosovo, by obvious reasons. But my first trip will be there. Because I believe that if we as Europeans, we are not able to solve this problem in our immediate vicinity, it's very hard to believe that we are going to be a geopolitical power. The important thing at the end is not what Spain is doing, because as far as China, India and Russia will not recognize Kosovo, Kosovo will not be a state. What do we have to do is to work hard in order to continue the talks. Kosovo has to withdraw their measures on duties, and Serbia has to engage in a full and deep and sincere dialogue. We started it several years ago. It lasts too long. You can be sure that this will be one of the things that will take more into consideration, because the status quo is not tenable. We cannot continue like this. And I'm happy that yesterday Kosovo went through a full democratic elections. We have to make an agreement between Serbia and Kosovo, and this will be my priority.
Thank you. Follow-up question, Sana Cañete, 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Borrell, you mentioned China, Russia and other countries who also did not recognize Kosovo, but they are not member states of the European Union. I'm a former diplomat, and I would prefer to ask you about EU external policy challenges. However, I feel obliged to raise a question of integrity. What conclusions have you drawn from the record in Spain resulting from the abuse of corporate inside information? What conclusions for this high office to which you are now designated? In this office, you will have access to immensely more important inside information. Thank you.
Siempre rechazado que haya hecho uso de ninguna clase de...
Well, I have always denied using any kind of privileged information. Let me just be very clear that we are talking about an operation for 9 million euros. It was covered 60% of my 7% of my portfolio, and 93% was kept in my power until its value was lost, and there was a 300 million loss, as you can see, through my taxes. I think anyone that had privileged or insider information here, and they just sold 7% of their shares, their portfolio in this way, and made losses of 93% of their portfolio. I mean, maybe it was done at an inappropriate moment, but if you're losing 93%, I don't think that really makes sense in terms of insider information or privileged information in this case. I mean, if only all insider trading operations were like this.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell. I would now like to give the floor to Maria Arena. She's not only an S&D colleague, she's also our chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Human Rights. The floor is yours, Maria.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Borrell, I refer to your comments on Monday. The comments from Sunday I don't find so interesting. Now, on the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union and the Charter of Human Rights, the respect of human rights, the principles of freedom, democracy, equality and the rule of law, these are guiding principles for us in the EU, whether we're inside or outside of its borders. Article 21 of the Treaty of the EU refers to the defence of human rights being at the heart of our dialogue and relations with third countries, whether we're talking about negotiating international agreements, trade agreements, or discussions on migratory policy. So which measures will you take to ensure that the whole of the Commission respects these principles and to ensure that policies taken by other commissioners, particularly the Commissioner for International Trade, will not go against these principles, particularly the principles of human rights? Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Arena.
Oui, Madame la députée.
Thank you very much. I understand your doubts here. In the real world, we often are stuck between reality and our principles. I think it's important, though, to have principles as our starting point. The EU is a guiding light when it comes to defending human rights more than anyone else in the world. This is an integral part of our work. Human rights is not just an issue of external policy. It's really at the heart of everything we do. So I think it's important we have a new action plan on human rights. The European Parliament will be involved, including, of course, the Subcommittee on Human Rights. We're talking about measures closely related to human rights. When we have countries with trade preferences, for example, they have to follow our human rights and our principles on labour standards as well. Now, you say these are just words and they're not actually applied, but they are applied and there are consequences here. I assure you, for me, human rights is not just the cherry on top of a trade agreement. It is an absolutely vital part of such an agreement, and of course its implementation as well. Parliament is there to help safeguard these efforts as well. by important work such as tackling child labour and ensuring that social and environmental standards are enshrined in our trade agreements. This is more and more important. Sometimes we see violations of human rights and we see this, and this has economic consequences as well. It's part of the geopolitical imbalances that we see today.
Monsieur, merci. Follow-up question?
Thank you very much. The EU will soon be holding discussions with India, Brazil, China, Israel, Russia, Kazakhstan, just a few there, and that is in the framework of our strategic dialogue. There are different agreements with these countries, including clauses on human rights that define the respect of human rights as a key part of the agreement. Specifically, how will we ensure that this is actually respected? This has not actually been followed up in any of these types of agreements. We want to ensure that the EU's credibility remains in this area. So how will you ensure that that's actually enforced in terms of our relations with bilateral countries in the strategic dialogue?
Malgré tout ce que vous craignez,
despite all of your concerns here, I think the EU is viewed as a reliable partner and a defender of human rights. Perhaps we are not doing enough, but thank goodness we are there. Specifically, in terms of what we're going to do, I am going to ensure that this clause relating to human rights is integrated in all of our bilateral trade agreements. I will also ensure that the EU's dialogue on human rights is related to politics and socio-economic factors in these countries as well, and that this actually leads to effective results, that there are specific points integrated for each country. We have an action plan for the upcoming few years. The EU has a lot of action plans, but we need to make sure these are actually implemented in real terms. And I would ask Parliament to work together with me to ensure that this is actually the case and the EU remains an example for human rights.
Thank you. I now give the floor to our colleague Nathalie Loiseau, who is not only a member of the RE group, but also our chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Security and Defence. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Borrell, Ursula von der Leyen has set out a clear ambition to lead a geopolitical commission. When it comes to security and defence, we need to raise our level of awareness in Europe of the need to do more to strengthen our common defence. That's something we all agree on. Already in 2016, our global strategy set out the goal of European strategic autonomy. The instruments have been made available. We have the annual Defence Capacity Review, the PESCO, or the European Defence Fund. It's incumbent upon us to take action, and we have the instruments to do so. What is still sorely lacking today is a shared strategic culture and doctrine. On a number of occasions, the European Parliament urged the High Representative to take action and publish a white paper on the defence and security of the Union. This is a long, complex task, but undoubtedly a vital one. And so, Mr. Borrell, are you going to undertake the preparation of that white paper?
Madame la députée, c'est vrai qu'il...
It's true, Honourable Member, that there is a lack, I'm not sure whether it's a sore lack, of a common strategic culture. We have made progress in that direction with PESCO and the European Defence Fund, but also with our operational plans as we pursue our security and defence policy. We've made headway on all three fronts, but it's not enough. If we want to make further progress, it's not what Mr. Min was saying the other day. We don't want to take intergovernmental work onto a community footing. We also need the process to work the other way and find an intergovernmental approach to community business. In pursuit of this, we have our strategic plans as a valid platform. Is that enough? Should we take our thinking a step further? In my view, the model of a white paper has proven its effectiveness in the national arena. It's undoubtedly a method which might provide inspiration for our future work in the European Union. You'll be well aware that it's a difficult task, however, one which will require us to be ready before we invest the human administrative resources. We have to be sure we're ready to take a further step. This will require political commitment from the member states. If that is forthcoming, if we can see that there's likely to be a positive outcome for this endeavour, then let me assure you I would be very much in favour of it, since I feel that we do need to go further in building up this shared strategic culture, while at the same time we need to bolster our cooperation with NATO. There's no contradiction there. The two are complementary.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell. Follow-up question.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. Amongst the instruments available to us, Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty has a mutual assistance clause amongst the member states. That article has already been invoked in 2015, following the terrorist attacks that hit France. We called upon the European Union. A number of our partners responded. We must build on 42.7 to make sure that we can have faster, better coordinated action arising from resort to that article. 42.7 seems all the more useful, since in the future it will enable us to tackle a number of threats, including the hybrid threats you referred to. What's your specific view on this? Can you commit yourself to assessing the way Article 42.7 is triggered, and what role would you seek to vest in the European Parliament where necessary? Thank you.
Go ahead. Mr. Borrell, please.
Sans doute,
Undoubtedly, the article you have cited is one which, as you say, we need to make operational. You invoked it at a dramatic juncture in French public affairs. Everyone was in agreement in principle, others put it into practice. In my view, this article, as well as, I believe it's Article 212, which deals with responses to common terrorist threats or natural disasters where there's large-scale assistance required because of unforeseen natural events. We do need proper rules to govern this. We need to explain how these provisions would be implemented. As I said before, you help shape our foreign policy. And this is a significant element in pinning down how we move from Sunday sermons to taking action on a Monday. We need clear guidance so that people can see that Europe is not a defence union. It's not like NATO. We don't have the equivalent of Article 5, but Article 42.7 that you mentioned is the closest thing we have to it. Let me say one thing. NATO's Article 5 helps us all to face a military threat. But when you have a hybrid threat, if you have a cyber attack launched, which isn't strictly speaking a military operation, NATO's Article 5 would not apply, whereas Article 42.7 of the TFU would.
Thank you. Next speaker is for the EPP group, Arnaud Danjean, for 1 minute, please.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur Borrell.
Thanks. Chairman, I'm over here, Mr. Borrell. With a very broad portfolio in terms of topics and geography, it almost looks like your mandate's a mission impossible. And unfortunately, for 10 years, no matter what the calibre of the person there, the balance sheet of Europe's diplomacy doesn't look great. The people we represent here are would have a trouble in mentioning one crisis in the last 10 years where European diplomacy had a key role in sorting it out. We seem to try and do a little bit all over the place, but it rather gives the impression that we are adapting a scattergun approach, and it doesn't help the profile of the High Representative. Don't you think it's time, Mr. High Representative Designate, that we actually have some small list of priorities? Obviously, you want to try and please everybody, but for you, what would be those small list of priorities?
Merci pour des...
Well, thank you for saying it's mission impossible. That's not really the kind of encouraging words I'd like. But when I was a member, we did talk about that when I was in the Commission. I thought it was a mission impossible myself. I was saying, well, you're trying to ask too many things of one individual there. But whether it's impossible or not, it's a really necessary mission. And we have to try and achieve it. In Spain, sometimes we used to say we did it because we didn't know it was impossible. And I saw what you said in a video on YouTube on European defence, and I very much agreed with your position. We need to develop more capacity, supplementary capacity, and indeed we need to focus on it. We can't be everywhere, because sometimes our ability to act isn't the same everywhere. You talked about mentioning some priorities. That's very difficult. No matter what I say, I'm going to leave somebody unhappy because I'm going to leave something out. But since you asked me to, I would say that the Balkans and the eastern frontier of Europe, that's the main priority of our external policy. We can't have ambitions to be global players if we can't sort out problems on our own borders. There's also Libya. We don't have a proper policy on that at European level, and perhaps we're not aware of the huge threat that an unstable North Africa represents for Europe. And it's difficult unless we sort things out there for Africa to play a balanced role in the new world. It's a huge task, but I'm confident that with your help, we'll be able to get something done.
Thank you. Arnaud Dajon, follow-up question, 1 minute.
Merci, Monsieur Borrell.
Thanks, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Borrell, for that very good answer, if you don't mind my saying. I agree with you that if we can't guarantee our own values and interests in our immediate neighbourhood, our pretensions as a global actor aren't terribly good. You talked about the people working in European missions, civil and military missions, and it's a major security and development thing that we've got going there. We've been trying to come up with identifying problems and doing something about them, but once again, we're not really doing much about it. What do you think about that part of the world, and what do you think we can do there?
D'une extraordinaire importance.
Well, it's incredibly important. I was in Niger and Senegal, and I don't think we're aware of how important the Sahel is for us here in Europe. It's really almost the southern border of Europe. They use the word fita in Arabic to describe the situation there. Ongoing structural conflict. You've got people who are cultivators, people who are shepherds, we've got constant conflict between all sorts of conflicts going on there. The whole imbalance that we can anticipate over the next few years will probably have at least some of it starting there. We need to build a kind of green border, which the ecologists have asked for, to stop the Sahara advancing further. We need also to carry out administrative military efforts, state building. That's the third of the priorities that are possibly even the top priority in many ways.
Thank you, High Representative Vice President Designate. We come to our next speaker for the S&D Group, Sven Mikser.
Commissioner Designate, I would like to come back to defense and security, but move from strategic culture to actual defense capabilities. When it comes to EDA and EDF and PESCO, I believe that on one hand, the goal of all those noble initiatives is to better focus our collective efforts and to boost our global competitiveness in the area of military industries and related R&D. But on the other hand, and perhaps more broadly, the goal is to make sure that we have at our disposal all the necessary capabilities to meet our international obligations and the ambitions set out in our global agenda. And therefore, my question to you would be, where do you see the greatest remaining capability shortfalls, and how do you intend to work both on the union level but also with the governments at the intergovernmental level in order to address those capability shortfalls?
Mr. Borrell, 2 minutes.
I'm trying to answer this difficult question in 2 minutes. Very concrete. First, we have agreed on a capability development plan which identifies 11 defense priorities. These include, be aware of that, cyber-responsive operations, air-to-air refueling, or ballistic missile defense. Remember that when we went on airstrikes to Libya, we didn't have the refueling capacity for our planes, and we had to have the help of the Americans. Third, these capabilities, we need them for our CSDP operational engagement. And we have to take into account also the compatibility and complementarity with the NATO priorities. Give me an example. The US has only one type of battle tank. We have 17 different types of battle tanks. The lack of cooperation between member states in the field of security and defense cost us about 30,000 million euros a year. We need to develop PESCO and the European Defence Fund. It's much more cheaper to spend on create cooperative capacities than to have many different capacities which are incompatible among them and too expensive to match. We have to match our ambitions with the resources, and the multi-annual financial framework is there. You will have to decide together with the Council. And also we have to pay attention to the civil management, which are for me as equally important as military missions. And for that we need another different kind of capacities. Policemen, judges, public prosecutors, and other experts.
Thank you. Follow-up question, Sven Mikser.
Thank you very much. I very much agree that cooperation is the key word here, but we have seen also in the past instances when we have managed to cooperate very impressively in order to build a certain capability, only to see it remain idle or underutilized. Well, I believe battle groups are a case in point. And, I do believe that battle groups have a value in the sort of transformational exercise that they have been. But given the constraints, financial and political, that we've seen, how do you see the ways to address those constraints so that we would be able to use the capabilities that we collectively build also purposefully? Thank you.
Mr. Borrell?
Yes, the famous battle group that we have never used, no? And nevertheless, they remain the primary tool for our military rapid response. And they are the only military forces on standby by the European Union in order to be able to deploy them in a short notice. So I think that we have to increase the common funding, which is currently under discussion, in the context of the European Peace Facility that my predecessor, Mrs. Mogherini, has proposed to you in order to provide an incentive for future deployments. Because when the moment came to mobilize these battle groups, it was impossible. Remember, it was the case with the Central Republic and Mali, that for different reasons, I don't want to criticize anyone, but for different reasons, the battle groups could not be mobilized. Well, if this battle group exists, we have to provide common funding, because they are the common tools of the European military capacity to be deployed.
Thank you, High Representative Vice President Designate. We come to the next speaker from the group Greens EFA, Ms. Yenbu, please.
Merci. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Borrell. You've said we need to be consistent internationally. I agree with you there, but I think we really should remember that we should put our own house in order first. You've said that you're a feminist, and how are you going to insist, and I would stress, insist that we get more women in the European External Action Service? 75% of the people at intermediate grades and 87% for higher grades are men. Are you going to have binding goals for equal opportunities in the EEAS as far as getting women mainstreamed into all levels, including the goal of 50% of women as heads of delegation by 2024, as per a European Parliament resolution? And also, what about the less favoured members of our population? You're supposed to reflect that, but often we see our diplomats as coming from the elite of our society. What are you going to do about that? How are you going to have more equality and diversity in the EEAS? The Chairman, Mr. Borrell.
Well, gender equality is one of the cornerstones of the European policies. President von der Leyen has clearly stated. Gender equality in foreign policy, it doesn't mean only to equality between men and women on the high post. We have to get it. Now we have about 1/3 or less than 1/3. To be frank, I think that it's going to be impossible to reach 50% on the time you have proposed. I can say yes, but I prefer to be frank, and say that the good target, the one we have to fight for, is about 40%. Remember that 1/3 of the posts on the External Action Service are provided by the national diplomatic corps, and they also have to fulfill requirements on the number of women. So there is a kind of conflict for the scarce resources that is today highly qualified women on the diplomatic corps. I found this problem at home, and I don't think that it's going to be possible to have 50% on the short term. But much more important, well, at least as much as important, is to introduce gender issues on the diplomatic and military activities abroad. I was watching yesterday a video of a colonel of the Malian army explaining the role of women in the army in situations of conflict like the one in Mali, saying that the fact that they were women was between the army, among the army, was the only way that women who were raped and terrorized and kidnapped had confidence on the army. We have to introduce the value of the gender on diplomatic and military activities.
Thank you. Follow-up question, Madame Yenbu.
Êtes-vous d'accord avec le
Do you agree that it's shameful that for the European Union that Edward Snowden's not received asylum in Europe? He blew the whistle on enormous NSA spying, and Europe has benefited very much from his information, and our member states have been extremely hypocritical about it, and he's been forced to find asylum in Russia. As head of European diplomacy, what would you do to change the position of the EU and also that would, I think, given us more credit when it came to geopolitical issues. Would you encourage heads of state and government in Europe to look again at the possibility of granting Mr. Snowden asylum? I believe he wants to have asylum in a European country. Thank you.
Minute, Mr. Borrell.
Señora diputada, honestamente.
Well, frankly, I don't think I can answer that question. I don't have the requisite information to say what kind of provide an answer for you. I'm being honest here, I don't know.
Thank you. Next speaker is for the ID group, Lars Patrick Berg.
Vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Borrell, in your written comments, you talked about making the most of the full potential of the Lisbon Treaty to use the possibility of qualified majority for the common foreign and security policy. Could you tell us a bit more about the areas of security where you think we could act with qualified majority voting, where this would be appropriate? Do you think this would constitute an erosion of the member states' sovereignty? You say the EU must be able to take quicker and more effective decisions, and we need to overcome these restrictions to our decision-making potential that could hinder foreign policy. Do you mean that you want to do away with those who have contrary opinions? And I also wanted to ask you about migratory policy. You say you're making decisions in the best interests of the migrants, but is this also in the best interests of European citizens? Do you think the migration waves we've seen in recent years are a threat to the member states or not? Thank you.
Herr Borrell, 2 Minuten.
Bueno, realmente son dos.
Well, it's two questions in one, really, there, but I'll try to respond to both of them in 2 minutes.
For me, it's a little bit contradictory to maintain the requirement of unanimity on financial issues like the financial perspective, where we are discussing about how to divide the 1% of the European GNP, and for that we require unanimity. And then we want to take decisions that are much more related with the important issues dealing, as I said, with human rights, war and peace, by qualifying majority. It would be much easier, my job. It would be much easier if we had count on qualified majority. But you cannot impose a decision to a member state against its will when it touches such important things. Let's go step by step. Let's start by using qualified majority on sanctions, in the case of Russia, to avoid the need of unanimity, on human rights, and on peace missions. And then we can go, if we are able to build this strategic common culture, in order to agree on such sovereign-related issues. If we don't have the same understanding of the world, we cannot have a common foreign policy. How long did it take to go from the common currency to the unique currency? How long did it take to go from sharing sovereignty partially in order to have a common but not unique, to finally get a unique currency which was, for sure, a complete abandoning and sharing of, not abandoning, sharing of sovereignty. So we have to go step by step, but the final purpose is to get decisions taken by qualified majority when the time comes.
Thank you. Eine Nachfrage, Herr Kollege, bitte.
Vielen Dank.
Do you have a follow-up question? Mr. Borrell, the second part of my question is about the persecution of Christians around the world. We've had a report recently from the UN about Burkina Faso, where Christians are persecuted and tortured, Christian communities destroyed. So this is taking part in the Sahel, and it's just one of the many examples we've seen over recent years. We strongly support protection of minorities, but it doesn't seem we talk about the protection of Christians enough. It might not be a popular position, but I hope we can at least agree that Europe is based on Christian values and should do more to protect those who share our values. Do you share concerns against violence against Christians in this area of the Middle East? Thank you.
I don't know if it is popular or not, but I agree with you, because freedom of religion is one of the cornerstones of the European civilization. We have been fighting among us for religion issues. The war of religions is something that has been producing bloodbath in Europe for centuries. And now we have learned to respect the freedom of religion, not only for the Christians, but for everybody. And I know very well what's happening in Burkina Faso, and I can add in Iraq, where Christian communities, all of 2,000 years, have been destroyed and perished. So for sure that we have to take this issue in all our external foreign policy engagements. In Burkina Faso is part of this I call first FITA, the general violence of everybody against everybody by religious, ethnic and economic issues. In Iraq, it has been much more grief. Much more grief.
Thank you. Next speaker is for VCR Group, Hermann Tertsch. 1 minute, please.
Buenas tardes, señor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Borrell, and welcome to our Parliament that you're familiar with. I'm over here. Good afternoon. I'm going to have to stress to you the importance of the issue of sanctions. You don't really seem to believe in them. If we had the same position on Venezuela or Cuba, let's see, if we'd had the same position in South Africa as we do with Venezuela now, there would still be apartheid on the African continent. You told us that there are 25 people subject to sanctions here, 25 Venezuelans under sanctions for the EU, while there are 5 million refugees fleeing the criminal regime in Venezuela, which is being protected and defended by Cuba. And we have 25 people covered by sanctions, and not one in Cuba.
Señor Tertsch, Herman, yo no he dicho que estoy...
Mr. Tertsch, I didn't say I was opposed to sanctions. I said I'm opposed to collective actions which will have a negative impact on the Venezuelan people. If you become familiar with the situation people face there, anything which will make it harder for people to get a bit more food or medicine is something which, in human terms, is just unacceptable. Having said that to our American friends, we made the point that we would not support sanctions against the people, but we would support individual sanctions against office holders. Spain decided to impose sanctions on 7 people accused of torture and killing in Venezuela. So I can assure you that we are concerned about freedom in Venezuela as much as you are, and that's why we're working to find the only possible solution, namely a negotiated solution amongst Venezuelans which will allow a democratic way out. I know that Cuba has influence there, but Cuba's not the only one. There are other countries too. The situation is rather more complex than it may seem. So I don't like to hear you say that I'm opposed to sanctions. What I am opposed to are collective sanctions hitting people in dramatic circumstances. Regarding the situation in Cuba now, well look, in this House, we adopted measures to isolate Cuba. And what was the impact of that? None whatsoever. A few years later, we moved to a policy on the basis of an agreement. Even the Pope has been to Cuba, Mr. Terch. And President Obama and the President of France. The only one who's not been yet is the King of Spain. Everyone else has been there.
Gracias. Follow-up question, Mr. Terch, 1 minute.
Querer presentar a Cuba como un país normal.
Are you suggesting Cuba is a normal country that everyone goes to, when really it's a cartel running a criminal regime in Venezuela, forcing 5 million Venezuelans to flee and destabilize the whole region, with 1.5 million refugees in Colombia? Are you saying Cuba is a country everyone goes to? It's a wonderful country? Don't you really think that we need to adopt measures against the last great communist dictatorship, which is destabilizing the hemisphere?
Sea un país magnífico. Creo que estamos.
I'm not saying Cuba is a wonderful country. I think we're speaking the same language, aren't we? Did I say Cuba was a wonderful country? I said that everyone goes to Cuba. Is that true or isn't it? Is it a fact or isn't it? Didn't President Obama and the Pope and the President of France all go to Cuba? We're the only ones who are not going. Now, you're saying it's the only communist dictatorship left in the world? Are you sure about that? Do you know what Raul Castro told me one day? Raul Castro once told me, you're talking to me as if I were from Vietnam or Saudi Arabia or China. It's true, there's a lack of basic democratic freedoms in Cuba that we aspire to for ourselves and for peoples that are our friends. And we're not at all complacent about this, but all I'm saying to you is that I think it's better to have a policy which allows you to be in touch and build up people-to-people, government-to-government relations, rather than an approach that we all know has failed.
Thank you, High Representative Vice-President Designate. We come to our next speaker from the EPP, Ms. Isabel Wissler Lima. Bitte sehr.
Président. Monsieur Borrell.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Borrell, freedom of speech, freedom of expression and media pluralism are at the heart of powerful democratic societies and need to be protected. What protection measures would you take to make sure that we don't have disinformation campaigns and hostile propaganda from outside directed against the European Union and its member states? Terrorism has already been mentioned by colleagues. That, of course, attacks fundamental freedoms and individual liberties of citizens throughout the world. What's your position on strengthening security measures which we need frequently, which countries have to apply, but do sometimes restrict people's freedoms? Right now, the number of political activists are fighting for the rule of law and the human rights. Often human rights defenders are attacked and sometimes even murdered. What do you think, in specific terms, in terms of making certain that human rights protection is borne in mind in our agreements over and above the economic aspects which you mentioned earlier?
Monsieur Borrell?
Bueno, creo que ya.
I think to a certain extent I've already answered this question. The EU does have the capacity that it has, and that is basically diplomatic relations and exerting political pressure, particularly on those countries who don't meet the standards which we call for. You mentioned the very serious problem of disinformation. This is something which doesn't simply come from Russia, although a lot of it does. And we need to be concerned, yes. Comment off mic.
Je n'avais pas nommé la Russie.
I didn't actually mention Russia, says the speaker.
Pero yo sí lo hago.
Well, I will, says Mr. Borrell. I mentioned Russia. It seems clear to me, everyone knows, that there are disinformation campaigns which are launched from servers based on Russian territory. I'm not saying it's the Russian government that's behind them. I talked to Minister Lavrov and Sputnik and Russia Today, he said, are private companies. But there is a disinformation process which is seriously affecting the democratic health of our countries, and disinformation is going to be one of the biggest problems that we're going to face when AI comes more on stream. You should prepare yourselves for this. And we've got three strands. One, Eastern Europe. We've got the rapid reaction force when disinformation is detected. We have a reduced intervention capacity. I'd like to see it beefed up because, as I say, the problem's going to get worse and worse. It's going to get worse because the technological instruments which are being developed. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Follow-up question.
Monsieur Borrell.
Mr. Borrell, I was pleased to hear your response, but I'd like more detail. Freedom of expression, as I said, goes hand in hand with freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and freedom of expression. The lack of human rights, a lack of tolerance, gives rise to conflicts and war. So what are your specific commitments and ideas when it comes to the new Global Exchange on Religion in Society platform, which your predecessor launched under the auspices of the EU? How are you going to work for the protection of religious minorities outside the European Union, and can you commit yourself to improving the position of the Special Envoy whose job is to protect religious expression? Inequality between men and women is spread throughout the world and often enshrined in law. What are you going to do to express our attachment to equality between the genders and to provide practical expression of that and do something about it on all continents?
1 minute, Mr. Borrell.
Bueno, me van a usted.
Well, once again, this looks like Mission Impossible, because I'm basically being asked to sort out inequality throughout the entire world. I'm aware of the Mogherini initiative, and I'm going to push it as much as I possibly can for a very simple reason. I'm not a religious person, but I believe very much in the freedom of religion, freedom of worship, and that needs to be fostered and protected, because there are many countries where that freedom is not respected. That was being reflected in some of the other questions that honourable members have asked. So the Mogherini initiative, which is very recent, it only dates from a month ago, from September, is something, I think, which needs to be further developed. And simply because of my own personality and my own desire, my own vocation, I feel that it's something I would easily be able to devote myself to, with your help.
Thank you, High Representative Vice President Designate. We come to our next speaker from the Renew Europe Group, Urmas Pait.
Thank you very much. Mr. Borrell, we are very much on the same line that neighbours are important. And the Eastern Partnership is a priority in the EU's foreign and security policy, since it is important for the EU to maintain stability and security around its borders and its neighbourhood. However, Russia continues to maintain conflicts, be it in Ukraine, Crimea, Donbas, in Moldova, Transnistria, in Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, thereby threatening also the security of the EU. And I'd like to ask, how do you intend to keep Eastern Partnership a priority in the EU foreign and security policy, also taking into account guaranteeing the necessary financial means in the EU budget? And what priorities do you have as regards Eastern Partnership, and what substantive steps do you plan to take to make progress in resolving these conflicts in these Eastern Partnership countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Urmas Pait. Mr. Borrell, 2 minutes.
Well, I think the best way of facing, let's say, Russian expansionism, if I can call it like this, or the Russian threat, if you want, is to help Ukraine, to reinforce Ukraine, to reinforce the resilience, their capacity to perform reforms and to become a fully fledged democratic and prosperous country. Sanctions to Russia will help to it. But I think sanctions should not be viewed as a policy in itself. It's a tool. And the Eastern Association cannot be seen as someone who goes against anybody. It's the way of building a ring of democratic states between us and Russia in order to keep a balanced implementation of the 5 guiding principles, which, by the way, provides enough flexibility to adjust and fine-tune wherever is needed. To summarize, the Ukrainian remains central to the strategic challenge, let's call it like this, strategic challenge that Russia poses, and is one, I told, the most important, one of the biggest priority in order to develop a credible foreign policy. We should be committed to pursue these objectives, and I know that there is not a strong unity among all member states. And we will be to talk frankly about it. We have to stick on this position. And if we are not able to keep united about it, and remember, unanimity is required, then we will have a problem. We will have a problem. So my first endeavor will be continue with this unity and to increase our support to the neighborhood countries. I am repeating again, it's not against anyone.
Thank you. Omar Spaid, follow up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yes, Russia has repeatedly violated international law and continues to maintain conflicts in the territories of its neighboring countries. 2008 Georgia, 2014 Ukraine, and as a result, EU and many other democratic states impose sanctions on Russia. I agree that consensus is important, but do you have maybe a bit more concrete plan as to how to keep a consensus on this issue between the EU member states? And also, what kind of other methods do you envisage the EU could and should use more than it has to be able to influence states violating international law to end these kind of violations? And what is also your position, for example, on adopting a so-called EU Magnitsky list on an EU global human rights sanctions regime? Thank you.
Thank you, Omas. 1 more minute, Mr. Borrell.
Well, I think it was Theodore Roosevelt who said, you speak softly with a big stick. Speak softly with a big stick. If you don't have a big stick, you better don't speak loudly. And the European Union has not a big stick. The European Union is not a military counterpart. And as far as I told you, and I repeat again, we have to be tough with Russia, but at the same time to understand that is someone with whom we have to deal. Not everything is being solved through sanctions over sanctions. We have to keep the sanctions, but at the same time we have diplomatic tools, and the 5th principle of these 5 principles opens the door to a selective engagement in order to establish in some fields the necessary dialogue in order to make things evolve.
Thank you. Next speaker from the non-attached is our colleague Nathan Gill.
In your opening statement, you said strong policy requires strong democratic support. You have also said on the 22nd of May of this year, when asked which is more difficult to renounce or give up, currency or foreign policy, your response was, it's true. A currency and a border are the 2 basic elements of a state's existence. It is not just the British who recognise this. Millions of people in every country of the EU do not want to give up their currency or their borders and their national armies which defend and police these borders. Do you think that you can get the Poles to give up the zloty or the Danes the krona? Are you saying the EU, with its borders and currency, is now the nation state? And how are you going to get strong democratic support?
Thank you. Mr. Borrell, 2 minutes.
Bueno, no recuerdo exactamente lo que dije, pero sí le puedo decir.
Well, I don't remember exactly what was said, but in the very first lessons you have on science and policy, you understand the concept of a state. But I don't like borders. I think they are scars that history has left on the face of the earth. They are made with fire and blood, and I think progress is about overcoming borders. And I think the EU is a clear example of that. Now, if any country is part of the euro, that's a sovereign decision, and nobody is made to be part of the European Union either. Those who want to leave can, if they can find an agreement to leave. It seems as if some countries are having a little trouble doing that right now. But of course, democratic freedom is the basis of our community. We are building a political community for the first time in the history of Europe.
Not based on who is stronger than the other one. It's not the empires. It's not from Charles V to Napoleon to the Bismarck. It's based on the will and political agreement and democracy. And this is such a big achievement that we Europeans, we must be very much proud of it. And if someone doesn't want to be part of this historical endeavour, he's for sure free to leave. And if you have decided to leave, you, the British people, I am very sorry. I would like to have you on board. But there's nothing against it. It's the proof that Europe is really a democratic endeavour, the fact that if someone wants to leave, it can. But believe me, I don't like borders. And the first thing we should do in the Balkans is to open borders.
Thank you. Follow-up question, Nathan Gill, 1 minute.
Okay, so you don't like borders, but my point was that there are millions of people within the EU who wish to maintain their national borders and who wish to maintain their national identities. So my question was, and I don't feel that you've answered it, how are you going to bring along the peoples of Europe in a democratic way? Your statement was very clear that when you have strong policy, you must have strong democratic support. How are you going to get that support? Is it your will, or, as we say in Britain, my way or the highway?
1 minute, Mr. Borrell.
No, mi voluntad no sería suficiente.
I don't think my will is sufficient there, but we are going to achieve this through what this Parliament represents. Here we have the democratic representative of the peoples of Europe, not the people of Europe, the peoples.
Demos. We have a plurality of demos. But you know, you can be European without having to renounce to your national identity. When I took possession of the European Parliament presidency, I said I am Catalan, I'm Spanish, I am European. And I can feel the three of them. They are not contradictory. Human being enrich himself having a plural identity. And this is what we Europeans are building. No one is being forced to participate on that. But I think it's the best thing that human mind has been able to do, to overcome the fight against identities in order to create a super identity that doesn't annuls, doesn't suppress the primary identity of each one.
Thank you, High Representative Vice President Designate. We come to our next speaker for the S&D Group, Mr. Nacho Sanchez Amor.
Bienvenido a su casa, señor Borrell.
Welcome home, Mr. Borrell. The EU's playing a vital role in the agreement with Iran, signed also by France, Germany, US and the UK. There have been 14 reports on the IAEA about this. It's a clear example of the support that multilateral diplomacy can achieve if it's led intelligently. And the EU plays a leading role in it. Obviously, President Trump has decided not simply to withdraw himself from the pact, but actually try to torpedo it with unilateral sanctions against Iran with extraterritorial effect. Unfortunately, the US and Iran are now involved in a situation of escalating tension. It's a country, Iran, where human rights are not respected, particularly those of women, and we're not certain how sincerely they complied with the plan before. So how will you work with Iran, with the other member states and the US to stop this sparking of some conflict in the Strait of Hormuz? Well, there's a lot of questions there.
Question. Voy a intentar contestar en 7.
I'll try and answer in 7 or 8 points. First of all, despite the fact that the US has withdrawn from the agreement, the nuclear pact, all the other states have stayed together and the pact still exists. Secondly, Iran turns to respect all of the agreement, all its content. We need to make sure that in the face of the US high-pressure policy, they come back with their own high resistance, because then we'll just have a clash. We are doing our part as far as the agreement is concerned. We've lifted sanctions, and we're trying to maintain trade and economic activity with Iran. We've applied very strict standards. The blockage which we mentioned and put in but it's been, we're trying to protect our own European companies. We need to continue promoting economic relations with Iran. We've got the special purpose vehicle to facilitate payments with Iran.
Try to avoid the collapse of the economic relations. And I am the coordinator of the Joint Commission of the Nuclear Deal. And it will be my mandate to ensure the implementation of this deal through close coordination with all parts. And for that, the political unity of the Europeans will be crucial. This deal has been the best achievement of our diplomacy. And I want to thank Mrs. Mogherini and Mrs. Alstom and also Mr. Solana for the extraordinary work they have done. We cannot miss this opportunity of playing a geopolitical role. We have to keep this agreement alive in order to defend our interests, our security, and avoid something worse.
Thank you. Follow-up question, colleague? No follow-up question? Then we come to our next speaker for the EPP group, Mr. Andrzej Halicki. 1 minute, please.
Panie Przewodniczący.
Thank you, Chairman. Once again, I'd like to talk about Russia, because Russia is a threat not only to its immediate neighbors. Aggressive disinformation policy, destabilization of European society is a fact, and we should counteract it. Also, from the financial and organizational point of view, I understand that you're in favor of diplomacy rather than sanctions. But my question concerns financial possibilities. Are you in favor of more financing for some projects that are already running? What kind of tools would you like to use in your diplomatic efforts? Do you think about the media or other steps that could counteract this aggressive disinformation policy that is conducted by Russia.
Mr. Borrell, 2 minutes.
We have to invest a lot to face the disinformation weapon, because it's a weapon. You know, democracy is a system that is built upon information of the citizens. I take my vote according with what I know. If what I know is false, my vote will be biased. And more what I know, I doubt it is true or not. I could put you an incredible amount of examples. The last one during the French elections or the European elections. So we have to invest much more. The Stratcom, the Rapid Response Cell. But you know, it's much more easier to send bad information than to make true. Because to send a lie, it's immediate and is widespread through the networks. To rebuild the truth and to send the same message in order for people to be aware of what's happening and what is the real thing, it takes a much more difficult and expensive job to do. So we have to invest more on that. And also, about Russia, I don't want to appear here as being against Russia. It's a country that provides us energy, with whom we trade. We cannot say Russia doesn't exist and just use the policy of sanctions. We have to reinforce Ukraine. You know, we have invested 50 billion euros in Ukraine in the 5 past years. It's a lot of money. We have to know what is this money serving for. And we have to continue helping them. Because if we really want to face the, let's say, cold challenge from the East, the best way is to create a ring of democratic and prosperous country in our eastern border. And it's not going to be for free. Europeans.
Thank you. Follow-up question, colleague Halicki.
Cieszę się bardzo z tego ostatniego zdania i
I'm very happy with what you said at the very end. Don't you think that we have a great project that is underused right now, the Eastern Partnership? Of course, after our neighboring countries have carried out the necessary reforms, I mean Ukraine or Moldova. These countries could be a guideline for the whole region, also for Russian society, as a model of how democracy can be built.
1 more minute, Mr. Borrell, please.
Pues seguramente tiene usted.
I'm sure you're right. I haven't yet studied the issue you mentioned in detail, but what doubt there can be, there's the issue of close relations between Belarus and Russia on the table today, and that, of course, is creating concern amongst our Baltic members, and that reminds me of events in Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, and what Mrs. Merkel said at the Munich Security Conference in 2015. We shouldn't forget that. This wasn't a new type of Munich defeatism, as some dubbed it. Rather, she was reflecting a desire for realism and compromise. Now, the year before the war in Russia, I was in Georgia. I was walking around the area bordering Georgia that was then occupied by Russia. You could feel that war was on the horizon and nothing was being done to stop it.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell. Next question comes from Mr. Pineda from the GUI NGL group. Please.
Presidente. Chair, Mr. Borrell. After the agreement that was signed, there were Palestinian representatives who decided to cede their territory in return for the creation of a Palestinian state. Israel did not respect this agreement, nor international treaties or UN resolutions in this area. The Palestinian people and their representatives are complying with the Oslo agreements and other international treaties. Israel, on the other hand, has turned the Gaza Strip into the largest open-air prison in the world. West Bank is full of settlers. There are armed colonists who are there, who are under the protection of the occupying Israeli forces, attacking the civil Palestinian population who are defenseless. They want Jerusalem to be the capital, and it's becoming the de facto capital of the Zionist state. What will you do to make Israel comply with international law, UN resolutions, and to respect the human rights of the Palestinian people?
Mr. Borrell.
Colleague, member of the European Parliament, you know that the European position is to defend the solution, the two-state solution. Not everybody has this same point of view, but our position up to now, and I hope this continues to be the EU position, is to defend a position based, one, on the creation of a Palestinian state that guarantees the rights of the Palestinian people, that guarantees the right to their also guarantees the right to existence of the Israeli state. So we want both at the same time. We are doing a lot for the Palestinians. You'll say it's not enough, but let me just remind you that at the moment the EU is providing around €1 million a day to help the Palestinian Authority, 300 million a year, and that has been the case since the Oslo agreements. This aid is vital for the Palestinian Authority to continue existing, and it's vital to give us hope for the creation of a two-state solution. We have 2 EU missions there, one that helps with capacity building, security and justice. And then the mission that we have in Rafah that's almost non-operational, unfortunately, due to the very difficult border situation in Gaza. So if anyone is providing assistance to the Palestinians, it's Europeans. If anyone is keeping alive the possibility of the creation of a Palestinian state that can coexist peacefully with an Israeli state, and that guarantees also the right to the existence and security of Israel and respects the right of the Palestinians, their own states, their own political structures, the prospect of peace and prosperity. It's the EU which is doing that. So we all need to be united, I think. It's not an ASRI Israeli or anti-Semitic position. We just want to see peaceful coexistence between these two peoples who have been in confrontation for such a long time now.
Thank you. Follow-up question, colleague?
Sí. La ayuda humanitaria.
It's true that the EU is maintaining humanitarian aid, fortunately, because we've seen cuts from the US, and I think otherwise we'd be experiencing a much more serious situation. But there's more than that which is needed. It's not just humanitarian assistance. We need policies. We've had enough of declarations. Mogherini, we can make up an encyclopedia with all of her declarations. They're simply useless, empty words. They haven't achieved anything at all. So we need recognition of the Palestinian state. That recognition would be very late, but it would be something. It would mean something to the Palestinians. It doesn't make sense that the EU maintains preferential treatment to a country that isn't respecting international law, international treaties and agreements. We have to apply the second article of this agreement that refers to human rights. Are you going to do anything to try and achieve this, Mr. Borrell?
En el sentido de romper los acuerdos comerciales con...
Are we going to break our trade agreements with Israel? No. There is some time since the Association Committee has not met precisely because of this. But we're not talking about withdrawing from these trade agreements, but not set up the council once again either. I am not a foreign minister who's going to tell others what to do. I am just going to try, if you put your trust in me, to come to common positions here. And there are really quite different, possibly even opposing views. Some want the Association Committee to meet as soon as possible once again, and the others want us to break all trade ties. So we have communications on the one hand speaking out against the rockets that are fired on the Israelis, and then we're accused of being pro-Israeli, and vice versa in the other direction. It's one or the other. It's harder to find solutions. You need to consider both sides in this.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell. Next speaker from the S&D Group, Kati Piri, please.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell, for sharing with us today your clear and outspoken vision on how you see many of the challenges that the EU is facing has to be addressed. The management of migration and integration will and must remain a priority in the years to come, in spite of the declarations of some European member states that closing borders and stopping migration is possible. However, the utmost should be done in order to stop the Mediterranean tragedies and to make sure that migration happens through safe, orderly and regular channels. And in this context, the linkage between the internal and the external dimension of migration is essential. Mr. Borrell, what kind of action do you intend to put in place for addressing the root causes of migration, and how do you envisage to enhance cooperation with transit countries? Thank you.
Mr. Borrell, 2 minutes.
I think migration has to be fully embedded in the foreign policy. It's not in my portfolio, but it is in my portfolio, because we will not be solving the migration problem without agreements with the origin and transit countries. If you go to a village in Senegal, you will see that Europe is a magnet. It's a magnet to the TV screens. If we are not able to make the difference between asylum seekers and migrants which don't deserve, according with the treaties, an asylum protection, we have to be able to make agreements with the origin and transit countries in order to fulfill an immediate reaction to that. You know what's happening today in the Greek islands? It's increasing the number of people arriving. On the last 2 months, it has increased. Now there are almost 20,000. Most of them are Afghans. They are not Syrians. They are from Afghanistan. What do we do with them? We have to give an answer. We cannot say that we make a difference between asylum seekers and economic migrants and then not being able on the ground to make this difference operational and let people in the beaches because we don't know what to do with them, letting them starving. The migration policy is a multi-layer policy. But the first thing we have to do is agree with the origin and transit countries in order to make migration regular. And let me tell one thing. European people are afraid of migration because they have in mind the strong spike of 2015-2016, which is not migration, was asylum seekers, people coming from the Syrian war, a peak of 1.5 million people. Now the numbers are not 1.5 million people, are about 20, 30,000 for the whole area. That is not an invasion. But take care. What's happening?
Thank you for sticking to your time, Mr. Borrell. 1 minute, Kati Piri.
Thank you, Chair, for chairing, I think, a remarkable session. And I'm sure in the future we will have more time also with Mr. Borrell to discuss this topic. A follow-up question. How do you see the possible implementation of the structures which were discussed during the last European Council, having the idea to move for more permanent structure to replace the current ad hoc arrangements? And how do you intend to work for ensuring that independent humanitarian search and rescue operations be decriminalised and reinstated in the Mediterranean Sea, along with and in cooperation with the EU and Member States' efforts and engagements in saving lives and combating trafficking?
Thank you. Mr. Borrell.
Señora diputada, espero, si usted...
Well, honourable member, if you pleasure...
discussing with issue, because I've been very much engaged on that. I spent the 2 last summer as Foreign Minister of Affairs of Spain with the phone in my ears trying to look for a solution for these boats in the Mediterranean with 200 people on board that nobody wanted. 200 people that nobody wanted. I think Europe cannot afford this situation. We cannot afford every summer to start discussing among us what do we do with 200 people. We have to have an agreement that automatically allows us to bring these people to land and then to decide what do we do with them. This is not a problem for Europe. It's a matter of the unwillingness of all of us to reach agreements. I told once again, we have to respect the national idiosyncrasy of different member states with respect to migration. It's not the same. I know, it's not the same. But as a civilization, talking every day about human rights, we cannot spend every month of August on the TV screens and the phone to the foreign affairs ministers to try to decide about what do we do with 200 people. You know, in Colombia, they have got 3 million people coming from Venezuela. 3 million people. Can you imagine what would happen in Spain if 3 million people were coming from Portugal? If we are afraid of 200 people?
Thank you, High Representative Vice President Designate. We come to our next speaker from the Green Group, Ms. Gregorova.
Thank you, and welcome, Mr. Borrell. I'm very happy to hear that I'm here. You acknowledge disinformation as one of the most important topics. What I liked slightly was more, specifications. So let me rephrase my colleague's question. What concrete measures will you put in place to fight disinformation and election interference? And, hand in hand with that, how will you guarantee freedom of speech and prevent internet censorship while fighting election interference? Another thing I was very glad to hear is that you won't advocate for arms sales again. And that you are keen on updating the common position. So let me ask you, are you prepared to strengthen the EU-level arms control by transferring the 8 criteria of the common position into community law? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell. 2 minutes.
Well, once again, there are 2 questions in one. It's difficult to answer. Look, arms export. Arms export, we have a common position coming from 2008, which is legally binding for member states, but is implemented under its responsibility. This common position requires 8 different assessment criteria that every member state has to follow in order to approve an arms exports. But it's up to member states to deny an export license if they have to take into account a clear risk that these arms may be used to commit serious violations of international humanitarian law. This is the rule. Unhappily, the Commission and the External Action Service, we, the European institutions. We don't have a mandate to monitor the member states' decisions on licensing arming. We don't have this mandate. Give it to us. Give it to us. But don't ask us to implement actions for which we are not authorized. The final decision remains a national discretion of the member states. And I remember you that on this field, action by the Council requires unanimity. And there is a big divide among member states about this issue. And if you have a big divide and it requires unanimity, this is an impossible mission, for sure. What do we have to do? To renegotiate the 2008 agreement in order first to exchange information. We should know what every country is doing, which are the sports that every country is doing, to whom, to how, and make, like some countries do, a follow-up of the use of this arm.
Thank you. Follow-up question?
Thank you. Well, I'm very sorry that my arms control question made you avoid the disinformation question again. So I hope I will hear it now. But I also have one other. The position you are being considered for is an immensely important public and representative role. Whatever you do and say will be on behalf of over 500 million Europeans. The person for such role, and I'm sure you agree, must be a role model and adhere to the highest moral and legal standards. Given your very troubling history with conflicts of interest, resulting in your forced resignation from a university and a separate €30,000 fine for insider trading, will you consider selling all of your current stocks in order to guarantee getting it out of the way? Thank you.
Mr. Borrell, 1 minute, please.
Bueno, creo que ya le he explicado.
Well, I believe I've already explained that issue of privileged information, but thank you for putting it again, because this will give you an opportunity to explain the case once more. Someone who carries out an operation with 7% of their stocks and shares and still has the other 93% and loses it all to the tune of €300,000, if he or she had access to privileged information, must be pretty stupid. So either you didn't have the privileged information or you were daft. Saying 7% to lose the other 30%, I don't really think I would have been using privileged information.
To make you believe that maybe I didn't make use of privileged information. Segundo, sobre la...
And then... Oh, my shares. Well, yes, I know that there was a lot of concern at the Legal Affairs Committee that I'd invested €12,000 in Iberdrola shares. Well, let me tell you, if they're that worried about it, I'll tell my broker to sell them tomorrow. I really don't think there's any problem there whatsoever. But if you see it as one, tomorrow I'll be shot of them for good. And then on disinformation, ...
The next speaker is Javier Nart from the Renew Europe group.
Señor Borrell, bienvenido y bien hallado.
Welcome, Mr. Borrell, to this point. I'm going to raise with you a security concern on our southern border, the border with the north of Africa. On this occasion, this is being directly hit by the situation in the Sahel and the Sahara. Security in North Africa means security in Sahara and Sahel countries. And you have to triangulate this with development, security and stability. Now, the imponderable is climate change, which is leading to a rise in temperature and certification. All these internal conflicts are being driven by terrorism and extremist Islamic movements. As High Representative, how would you square up to this issue, which involves those three angles of security, development and stability?
Question.
Mr. Nart, You're putting this question in an appropriate image of a triangle, development, terrorism, and climate change. Well, we won't be able to tackle the problem just by dealing with one corner of the triangle. Extreme poverty hits 50% of the population of these countries. In Burkina Faso, a third of the schools have been closed down. Insecurity has grown despite our efforts to avoid it. We are the main donors, indeed. Over the last 7 years, we've spent almost €4 billion in the Sahel. But if we really believe that 5 million square kilometres, 5 million square kilometres, 10 times the area of Spain, with an area which will soon have 200 million inhabitants, if you imagine that can be covered, 300 gendarmes can patrol non-existent borders there, then you're just being completely unrealistic. The cost of not investing in the Sahel today will be a very heavy one. We need to anticipate the cost and invest every possible resource we can muster in the Sahel, because otherwise... Do you know, the way we should approach this is by empowering women. Do you know what the Sahel region is like? Go along to maternity hospital in Niamey, the capital of Niger. If you go to the hospital there, you realize that there are women with an average of 7 or 8 children, and they start bearing children immediately after puberty. If this goes on, you're never going to be able to achieve any proper stabilization of the population, and unless women in the Sahel region are liberated, with the huge cultural implications that involves, and it's not something you can just hand down from on high. Don't turn around tomorrow and say, things will be different tomorrow and so on. No, it'll be just the same, unless we invest at every level. And I can assure you that the cost of not doing this will be very heavy for Europe. Well, you've mentioned population growth. Niger has one of the highest birth rates in the world, but I'd like to mention 2 different countries to you. One which is well consolidated, Burkina Faso, and a non-existent country, Mali. In both of these places, the situation has got worse, despite the very significant economic and military training assistance provided by the European Union. How do you intend to respond, given the very poor return we seem to have got for our investment? Mr. Borrell, yes, this has been disappointing. 4 years ago, the peace agreement was signed in Mali, and there's been very little headway made since then. Mali is a crucial country. It's certainly having a knock-on effect on Burkina Faso. As I was saying earlier on, that there's this close road between the ethnic dimension and religious dimension, the economic dimension, the traditional struggle between the landowners and the farmers, and those with herds of cattle. The conflicts were already arising long before Islamist terrorists turned up and destabilized a range of countries. How can we act here? All we can do is to step up our level of engagement. We must send more peace-building missions. We must send more missions to help with state-building. Do you know what's going on in the Sahel? There's been a failure to build up what we would regard as a state. Defense, security, and police functions from the colonial period of what remained, but the state as a provider of services, which is what gives legitimacy to a state, as a body which should have the monopoly on power, is something that is, on the use of funds, is something that has not happened. Structures inherited from the pre-colonial period have remained, and the modern shape of a state has not emerged.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell. We come to the final speaker, Michael Gahler from the EPP Group.
The discussion here motivated me to ask a follow-up question on Cuba. You said everybody is traveling there, Well, the truth is almost everybody, but not this Parliament. Will you commit to support us that this Parliament can pay a visit there with the composition of members we want and to talk to everybody we choose? Do you commit to pursue an EU policy to establish a roadmap towards free, pluralistic elections in Cuba? Why do we support and demand democratic elections in Ukraine in the Eastern Partnership, in Turkey as a candidate country, in Tunisia in the Southern Partnership, in Venezuela and everywhere in Africa, but let the Cuban people down? The Cubans had no free elections with Batista and not with the Castros. Do the Cubans not deserve free elections? Is there any argument from you to support these political dinosaurs who deprive their people of basic human rights and democratic freedoms? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Borrell, 2 minutes.
Muchas gracias, señor Galler.
Thank you, Mr. Gahler.
Of interpretation. I haven't said that everybody has gone to Cuba but the European Parliament. I said almost everybody has gone to Cuba but the head of state of Spain. But Spain. I haven't said anything about the European Parliament, and I don't know what do you want to do, but the fact is that everybody has gone to Cuba, but not Spain. And believe me, we have strong links, historical with Cuba, with our society. Among many of them are coming from Spain. So this is what I've said. I am not saying anything in favor of Cuba being a democratic country the way we understand democracy, because for sure it's not. For sure it's not. And we have to work in order to make the society to evolve, and the best way for doing that is to keeping in touch, to have relations, and to have a certain leverage. Because closing doors and blockading them, we already did, remember. It was not useful at all. And by the way, allow me, if you want to think about people where the democratic freedom is not being respected, you have many examples much closer to Europe than Cuba. Much more closer. But it doesn't justify anything. No. La peste no justifica el cólera, como decía mi médico. ¿No? Pero, por favor.
Let's not try to sort out the problem of Cuba with methods that we've tried already and haven't worked, and pretend that Cuba's some kind of anomaly in the world. In Cuba, at least, you don't have death sentences, and nor do they crucify people.
Follow-up question, Michael Gahler, 1 minute.
I'm coming to my originally planned question, the special partnership between the European Commission and the Parliament. Will we have with you a partner that works in the spirit of intergovernmentalism or in a communitarian spirit? You have lived in both worlds. And will you commit to close cooperation with the EP with regard to formulating policy strategies, but also in practical terms on the ground? Successful example for such practical cooperation from Washington and The Hague prove this usefulness in the cooperation of the EP liaison and information offices with our EU delegations. Would you commit to support the opening of new EP liaison offices in New York, Addis Ababa and Jakarta, at the UN, the African Union and ASEAN? Thank you very much.
Mr. Borrell, 1 minute.
Dios, pues.
Blimey.
I cannot assure you that I don't know what you are talking about, frankly. No sé, can you be more precise or to insist on the question? No. You have been precise. You have been precise, but I understand the question. What I don't have is the answer.
Okay. Thank you. Let me first of all thank all members for their questions, but also let me thank the High Representative Vice President Designate for his answers. I will now give the floor once more to Mr. Borrell for his brief closing statement of 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
May I have a cup of coffee?
Sure, have a coffee first.
Presidente, onorevoli membri, vorrei ringraziare tutti per le domande significative.
I'd like to thank you all for the fascinating questions and the way that you've shown how much common ground there is between us, as well as the differences between us as well. Let me make some final comments. I was just showing I could speak Italian there.
First, it seems to me that in terms of foreign policy, after listening to all of you and after having prepared this hearing quite carefully, it seems to me that the European Union is facing three problems: identity, positioning, and method. First, identity. We still hesitate whether we are a global actor that uses all instruments of power, soft and hard, or not. I think we don't act in these terms. We still don't act in these terms. And I think that we could and we should. Second, positioning. We struggle to have a real common position in relations with the world biggest power, US, China, and Russia. We manage much better when we have a problem with the middle powers, regions, or specific topics. But when it comes to big powers, we tend to avoid the debate and up with a technocratic approach, these thousands of communiques. Third, a problem of method. The institutional system of the External Action Service and Commission is, to my understanding, and is not a criticism to anyone, policy light and process heavy. I think we must develop to provide a real added value to what member states need and want. Everybody agrees that we have seen a tendency on renationalization of foreign policy back to the capitals. It's not the European Union. It's a member state, the most influent one, the most ready to act. Everyone has in mind who I'm talking about. One may regret this, but for me, it underlines the need to ensure that the European Union system has to be more fit for purpose, to avoid duplication and bureaucratic routine, producing a stronger and deeper strategic analysis. I think we don't do that enough. And we have to regain a sense of initiative and action. You can ask, you can wait, you can hope something from me. It's just that, to regain a sense of initiative and action. Dear members, foreign ministers could help a lot the High Representative. I don't have the capacity of being everywhere. But there are 28, well, maybe soon 27 foreign affairs ministers that can help, that can be tasked to ask and to work and to talk and to travel as chef de file on particular issues that their countries know much better than others. This innovation could enhance member state ownership of the European foreign policy. I think we have to provide, and you will help to that, I will ask you to help to that, more strategic papers with clear policy choices and consequences. Someone has said, we have to nurture a culture of thinking geopolitically, building a common strategic culture across Europe, between Europe and the capitals. We are not going to do anything against the will of the capitals. And the capitals have to understand that we bring them a value added, the value added of a common thinking and the pooling of our capacities. Dear members, A foreign policy reflects a certain understanding of the world and is deeply rooted on history. We have different histories. We cannot understand the same relationship with the United States, let's say from Poland or from the States, from Spain. No. But we share a common vision of the world. If we are together, it's because we share a common understanding of the world to defend our civilization. We call it civilization because we Europeans, we are a civilization. Democracy, solidarity, prosperity. We can do much better use of the EU delegations. We can recall that the Foreign Affairs Council is a decision-making body that have to bring out orientation debates, yes, but it would be much better to arrive at concrete outcomes and common actions. I am a member of the European Council. It's my duty to go to the European Council and put there the most important issues of the foreign policy. It's an extraordinary privilege to be able to do that, and I am willing to do so. Finally, su questo, come su tutto il resto, sarò lieto di lavorare.
I'll be delighted to work with close cooperation, or in close cooperation with the European Parliament, because I'm convinced of the possibilities of parliamentary diplomacy. I'm very conversant with your resolutions, with your electoral observation missions, and I know they've got a crucial role in the shaping of European foreign policy, which has to be credible.
Colleagues. High Representative Vice President Designate, let me thank you for this final statement. Let me thank you once again for answering all our questions. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, this concludes our hearing. I wish you all a nice evening. Well done, Mr. Borrell.